It was a sterile room, humming faintly with recycled air and low-band frequency monitors. Tables of surgical steel, diagnostic panels, walls lined with biospecimen storage units. The usual setup in a coalition xenomedical research wing. To the Varnathi surgeon named Trelvek, it was the most sacred of spaces. Knowledge lived here. The ability to understand the strange mechanics of alien bodies and unlock their medical secrets without prejudice or panic. Trelvek had dissected over 24 species. He had reconstructed the vascular structure of the Yulande from a single cell. He had diagrammed the redundant respiratory chains of the Krelax and published 4 monographs on gelatinous neurology. Nothing surprised him anymore, until he met Darren Price. Darren had been recruited from Earth as part of the Coalition's Human Integration Initiative. He was a combat medic, former Marine, currently serving as an interspecies trauma responder aboard the Arcadia-class vessel Verity. It was a well-earned role. He worked with unshakable calm, patched holes in organs Trelvek had never heard of, and once restarted a Tulvan heart using a defibrillator and a spoon. Trelvek had requested his voluntary participation in a comprehensive physiological analysis. Darren agreed with a shrug and a smile, hopped onto the exam table, and proceeded to baffle every diagnostic scanner the alien team possessed. "Your hormone balance is chaotic," Trelvek noted, gesturing to the fluctuating panel. "These spikes. Are you in pain?" Darren chewed on a protein bar. "Nah, just hungry." "You're secreting cortisol." "Yeah, that's my body's way of yelling at me to stop skipping meals." Trelvek blinked. "Your species punishes itself chemically for neglect? More like it nags us into action." The scans continued. Muscle density inconsistent across limbs. Bone repair markers from at least 6 previous fractures. Scar tissue that told a brutal history. His organs were mismatched in endurance levels. Trelvek observed silently, cataloging it all. Then he paused at the adrenal glands. 2 small structures perched atop the kidneys, shaped like irregular pyramids, harmless looking. In Varnathi biology, similar structures served only minor endocrine regulation, but in the human scans, they pulsed with biochemical energy. Not just routine hormones, something more potent. "What are these?" Trelvek asked, rotating the 3D scan. Darren peered over. "Adrenal glands." Trelvek leaned in. "They are active, even during rest. Why?" "They're always ready to go." "For what purpose?" Darren leaned back on the exam bed and smiled. "Panic superpowers." Trelvek paused. "That is not a medical term." "It should be," Darren replied. "Basically, when we're scared or stressed, those things pump out chemicals, adrenaline mostly. It kicks everything into high gear. Heart rate spikes, lungs take in more oxygen, blood flow gets rerouted to the muscles. We get stronger, faster, think sharper. It's automatic." Trelvek stared at him. "You're describing a stress response designed to activate?" "Yep. But fear should induce system-wide retreat, conservation, paralysis to avoid detection. That is the instinctual baseline." "Not for us," Darren said. "Fear is fuel." Trelvek recorded everything. "You? Escalate function in response to mortal threat?" "Yup. One time I lifted a steel beam off a guy who got pinned under it. I couldn't even budge it 2 minutes later, but right then, adrenaline had me dialed up to 11. Trelvek turned toward the observation panel, muted his translator, and relayed quietly, "Begin emergency literature review. This species may activate combat performance during peak duress. Verify against historic data." The research assistant returned a moment later with a historical overview of human conflict, which only made things worse. They found verified instances of humans surviving impalements to complete objectives, others who stayed awake for 4 days straight to keep comrades alive, one who walked on a compound tibia fracture for 20 miles under enemy fire. All coincided with high adrenal spikes and sudden, irrational survivability. Trelvek asked for medical logs. They were worse. "Why does your kind not shut down in the face of terror?" he asked Darren directly. Because shutting down gets you killed. Do you not fear death? Sure, but fear just tells us what's important. We don't always fight because we're brave. We fight because we're scared, and the only way through is forward. Trelvek did not respond for a full minute. Then he added a note to the report. Human physiology appears designed to transform acute psychological stress into rapid physical augmentation. This is contrary to all previously studied sentient species. Fear does not reduce their combat capability, it enhances it. Immediate study required. Potential for misclassification may as baseline sentient may have occurred. Reclassification recommended. High-risk survivalist species. The exam was extended. Darren underwent stress testing under mild controlled conditions, all within ethical boundaries. Even at low-risk stimuli, simulated combat sounds, unexpected alarms, his blood pressure rose with perfect coordination. His reaction time improved measurably. Trelvek watched the monitors rise, then normalize, then overshoot in favor of performance. "I do not understand," the surgeon admitted. "We evolved being hunted," Darren said, "by animals, each other, the weather. Evolution didn't build us to hide. It built us to get up after we've been hit and swing back harder." Trelvek observed his resting heart rate, elevated but calm. The next day, they took Darren aboard the research cruiser Vastrius for a simulated disaster drill. The scenario? A decompression sequence failure, with 3 crewmates pinned under rubble. All actors. But Darren didn't know that. They triggered the alarm. Darren sprinted without hesitation, cleared a 12-meter corridor in 7 seconds, lifted one of the faux beams using a lever mechanism improvised from a vent rod, used his body to shield another injured crewmate while sealing off the corridor. Afterward, with sweat pouring down his face and his pulse at 145 beats per minute, he asked, "Did the evac pod launch?" Trelvek nodded. It was never in danger. Darren blinked, wiped his brow, and then said, "Good, still got it." He passed out 5 minutes later from exhaustion. Trelvek and the medical team ran a full diagnostic. His muscles showed signs of micro T-tears consistent with extreme physical strain. Electrolyte depletion confirmed high stress output, yet no long-term damage. His recovery started immediately, assisted only by IV fluids and rest. He was back on his feet the next day. Trelvek sat alone in his office that evening, watching the hollow recording again. The footage of Darren throwing a broken pipe aside, hauling simulated victims across the deck, barking orders through gritted teeth while injured, all while his biology accelerated instead of collapsed. He added one final line to the official report. "Humans do not flee from fear, they weaponize it." Darren's next assignment was to the Vasari Field Clinic, a newly built trauma outpost orbiting the edge of Coalition territory. It was meant as a neutral medical facility, open to any Coalition-aligned species, Varnathi, Kralax, Cerosians, even a few reluctant Krasik, all species that operated under the universal assumption that intense fear led to submission. Shut down. Fleeing. And then Darren walked in, carrying 3 boxes of surgical kits and a cup of coffee, chewing on something unidentifiable and waving like he ran the place. Trelvek arrived 2 cycles later as the overseeing research coordinator. The Coalition had quietly pushed his findings up the chain. Multiple species now wanted deeper insight into what humans did under stress. The question wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was survival. In the 3rd week, a crisis hit. A Krasik freighter attempted to dock with a breached fuel chamber. The explosion tore through the adjoining bay, venting half the facility. The entire left wing went dark. 25 crew members were trapped in pressurized compartments with failing seals. Standard protocol called for shutdown, containment, and remote extraction. Darren didn't wait. He jammed a rebreather onto his face and sprinted into the corridor before the emergency shutters fully closed. Trelvek barely caught a glimpse of him disappearing into smoke and flickering lights. "Where's he going?" a technician asked. Trelvek answered without blinking. "To retrieve them." In that moment, he understood. Fear wasn't a hindrance to Darren. It was permission. Permission to override caution, to access reserves that didn't make sense on paper, to run into a breach with improvised gear and medical tape in sheer, irrational belief that he could pull people back from death. 2 hours later, the corridor sealed again. Darren limped out. He had second-degree burns across his forearms, 2 cracked ribs from a falling support beam, and a dislocated shoulder. He'd reset himself. He'd saved all 25 crew. 1 required leg amputation, 2 needed temporary lung support, but they were alive. They carried him to medical. He refused surgery until every patient had been stabilized. The burn wounds were cleaned and dressed, the ribs confirmed via imaging. No puncture to the lungs, but 1 rib would require immobilization for at least 6 weeks. The shoulder had been reset adequately, but residual swelling needed to be managed with medication and guided restriction of movement. He was officially grounded. Trelvek visited him during his recovery in the medbay. Darren lay flat, IV lines attached, his arm in a sling, ribs wrapped in elastic bandages. "You should have waited for protocol," Trelvek said. "They'd be dead if I had. Your injuries are severe. I've had worse." "That is concerning." Darren shifted slightly and grimaced. "What's worse is when you do nothing and people die anyway. You defy every principle of biological preservation." "No, I just know how to prioritize." The swelling in his shoulder subsided slowly. Movement returned in stages. Painkillers helped for the first few days, but Darren refused them after that, citing dullness. Instead, he opted for guided breathing, thermal wraps, and short, painful walks, assisted by the nursing staff. It was during one of these walks that a Serosian medical student approached, visibly shaken. "I do not understand," the student said. "You walked into flame, into collapse. We are taught that retreat is wisdom." "Sometimes it is," Darren said, breath slightly labored. "But wisdom without action is just thinking about problems while people die." The student stared, then recorded the line in his log. Back in his quarters that night, Trelvek sat with his notes. The adrenal surge during the crisis had pushed Darren's blood pressure to levels that would rupture vessels in most species. His heart rate remained above 140 beats per minute for 45 straight minutes, muscles exhibited overexertion strain, and protein breakdown markers were dangerously high. And yet, recovery had already begun. Muscle tissue was regenerating within expected timelines, and the burns were healing without infection. Trelvek entered a new observation into the database. Secondary observation. Human endocrine systems create risk, not safety. Yet in managing that risk, they become more responsive. Stress is not suppressed, it is integrated. Behavioral response patterns are driven by meaning over survival instinct. They will die for strangers, if the context justifies it. Recommend Psychological Codex Update. Prioritize value-based logic in human threat assessments. Darren returned to limited duty after 20 days. The shoulder sling remained. His ribs hurt when he turned too fast. He still couldn't run, but he walked every corridor, checking on every crewmate he'd pulled from that wreckage. One day, in the mess hall, a Krelax engineer approached. "You were afraid, yes." "Terrified," Darren said. "But you went in." "Fear's not a brake pedal," he said. "It's the gas." The Krelax, whose species traditionally entered stasis during high stress, simply nodded, disturbed. Later that night, Trelvek submitted a private paper to the Coalition Medical Review Board. "We have misjudged the human relationship with fear. It is not a sign of weakness, but a signal to mobilize. Their physiology doesn't collapse under stress, it crystallizes. While other species withdraw, humans expand their capability. Their biology is an engine of emergency. Their hearts beat faster to reach others. Their pain does not isolate them, it guides them. Where others freeze, they ignite." In a follow-up review, one admiral asked, "Are they dangerous?" Trelvek responded, "Only if you are." Darren's body was still in recovery when the evacuation order came in. A planetary outpost on Farron 9 had been struck by an unknown pathogen. The atmosphere had shifted from stable to toxic in less than 48 hours, and several of the native species had already entered metabolic shutdown. Coalition Command activated a rapid response containment mission, and though Darren had only just returned to light-duty status, he volunteered without pause. Trelvek tried to object. "You are not cleared for physical exertion. I'm not going there to lift debris. I'm going to keep people alive. Your ribs have not fully healed. They're better than the lungs of anyone breathing that air right now." Trelvek did not argue further. He arranged for reinforced environmental armor and ensured Darren's medical file was accessible to the entire planetary med crew. The field suit was built to support weakened limbs and minimize pressure against the thorax. He would be in pain, but he would not collapse, not immediately. They landed on Farron 9 12 hours later. The colony was half buried in gray fog. Wind carried dust with chemical traces that corroded soft membranes. The pathogen didn't behave like a typical virus. It spread through microfractures in filtration systems. Breathing unfiltered air for more than 5 minutes caused pulmonary edema and neurological confusion. The alien medics wore sealed suits, precise and careful. Darren walked directly into the isolation wing with a manual resuscitator in one hand and a portable oxygen injector in the other. 2 patients were already coding. Darren dropped to his knees, grunting at the rib pain, and began bagging one while directing the alien assistant to prep a drip for the second. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He moved with clinical urgency and grit his teeth only when the pain got sharp. "You're leaking blood into your vest," one medic said. "Means it's working," Darren growled. They stabilized both patients. Trelvik arrived an hour later and found Darren standing at a portable operating station, slouched slightly but focused. Sweat ran down his face beneath the suit's internal lining. His vitals were erratic. Blood pressure had climbed, heart rate was up, all consistent with another full adrenal response. "Darren," Trelvik said through the channel, "you must rest." Darren didn't look up. 3 more in triage. "I'll rest after." "You risk internal re-injury." "Not the worst thing I've risked." When they finally pulled him from the floor, 3 hours later, barely conscious, dehydrated and wheezing from internal strain, he had personally treated 17 patients. 2 would have died without his direct intervention. His oxygen stats were critically low. His healing rib had shifted from strain, and his right hand showed signs of nerve inflammation from overuse. The medevac team carried him out on a cot. In the shuttle, Trelvek sat beside him, monitoring vitals as he received fluids and mild sedation. Darren drifted in and out, murmuring things about oxygen saturation levels and IV pump calibration. "You require several days of full rest," Trelvik said. "At minimum." Darren blinked slowly. "You sound like a disappointed uncle." "I am a disappointed physician." "They're stable?" "Yes, because of you." Darren closed his eyes. "Good." On the station, Trelvek helped oversee his care directly. Imaging confirmed the displaced rib wasn't puncturing anything vital, but would prolong his recovery by another 4 to 5 weeks. Nerve irritation in the hand required ultrasound therapy and dexterity exercises. The medical team enforced mandatory rest, but Darren pushed for light rehab after the 3rd day. They compromised, stretching only, no patient contact. Even so, patients from Farron 9 sent thank you messages. One recorded a video, a 6-limbed alien with bandages over their gills, voice still raspy from the toxin exposure. "You walked through poison for us. I will remember that when I teach my young what courage is." Darren watched the message in silence, face unreadable. Then he muttered, "Just did what anyone would." Trelvek nearby corrected him, "Not anyone, you." In private, Trelvek updated the Coalition Medical Codex. Tertiary note: human adrenal overdrive activation appears to persist even under pre-existing injury. Previous trauma does not limit stress response, it amplifies it. Known recovery timelines are often disregarded during high-stakes intervention. This is not recklessness, it is a pattern. Their sense of duty overrides biological constraint. They risk collapse as routine if the stakes are high enough. Word of Darren's actions spread, quietly at first, mostly in clinical updates and medical logs. But then a Varnathi news relay picked it up, dubbing him the responder. A Krelax station aired security footage of him bracing a collapsing ceiling with one shoulder while shielding an unconscious nurse. The reactions were mixed. Some species expressed admiration, others alarm. Coalition legal forums debated whether humans needed stricter deployment regulations. Trelvek was asked to speak at a safety hearing. "The issue is not regulation," he said plainly. "The issue is expectation. If you rely on humans to stop your catastrophes, you will build systems that expect miracles. And if they fail, they will still try, even when they shouldn't." Later, Darren was asked if he minded being called the responder. He said, "I'm just a guy who runs toward noise when others run away." Trelvek sat across from him that evening. "Why do you do it?" Darren looked at the ceiling. "I don't like feeling helpless. If I'm moving, helping, pushing, I don't freeze. You are afraid. Every time. You convert fear into action. That's the only way I know how to survive." Trelvek stared at him for a long moment. "You do not weaponize fear," he said softly. "You turn it into resolve." Darren didn't answer. He didn't have to. The Coalition's Central Bioethics Summit convened once every standard year, but this one was different. It was being held aboard the Atholan Spire, a rotating diplomatic citadel in neutral orbit between two systems. And this year, one of the key topics was the human stress response. Not just as a biological feature, but as a political concern. Darren wasn't supposed to attend. He was still in physical rehab, down to 3 hours of light exercise a day and limited mobility in his shoulder. The nerves in his hand were still recovering, but grip strength was back. Trelvek had advised strongly against unnecessary travel, but the summit invited him directly. And so Darren arrived in a plain, breathable, formal suit, every step measured, but steady. His ribs had healed completely. He no longer needed pain management. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and survived it. The auditorium chamber was filled with delegates from over 30 species. Some of them had never seen a human up close. Others whispered to each other with cautious awe. A few outright frowned. Their species had no context for a creature that ran toward chaos on purpose. Darren waited silently until his name was called. Then he stepped onto the platform, faced the seated gallery, and adjusted the collar of his jacket. Trelvek watched from the first row, recording every biometric cue from Darren's performance. Blood pressure, elevated but steady. Heart rate, a little fast, within range. Cortisol, active. Adrenaline, rising. But no tremors, no stammering, no signs of collapse. Just focus. Darren looked up at the hundreds of alien faces and said, "I was born on a planet where storms could kill you, predators hunted at night, and one wrong decision meant not making it home. You learn to run, sure, but you also learn to fight." A pause. A deep breath. We didn't evolve to retreat from fear. We evolved to ride it, to channel it. Sometimes that's reckless. Sometimes it costs us. But fear, for us, isn't a shutdown. It's a signal that something matters enough to risk pain, or death, or failure. A Krelax delegate raised a hand. "And you see this as useful?" Darren nodded. "If your instincts say flee, then you survive. If ours say act, sometimes we help others survive too." Another voice came from the back, a Saurian official. "Your biology disregards self-preservation. How is that sustainable?" "It's not," Darren said plainly. "We break, we get hurt, we burn out. But we also save people no one else could. We hold the line when others run, not because we're braver, because we don't know how else to be. No applause followed, no cheers, just quiet. And in that quiet, something shifted. Later that cycle, the summit ratified a resolution. Humans would be designated Tier 1 adaptive responders under coalition law. It was more than a title. It granted emergency intervention authority, special deployment rights, and structured rest mandates to protect them from their own instincts. It also required all coalition medical institutions to study and understand the human endocrine stress model in greater detail. Trelvec was named chair of the Research Advisory Board. Back aboard the Verity, life continued. Darren returned to duty with full clearance. He no longer needed special armor. His mobility had returned. He resumed morning drills, slower than before but consistent. He drank bitter coffee, muttered at malfunctioning scanners, and checked every pressure seal twice. But something was different now. Aliens came to him not just for procedures or emergency triage. They asked about adrenaline, about fear, about how to cope with it, how to use it. A young Tolvan trainee asked once, "Does the shaking ever stop?" "No," Darren said, tapping his chest. "You just learn to carry it." He became more than a responder. He became a teacher. Trelvec, for his part, compiled all findings into a final study. It was a dense document: anatomical charts, hormonal pathways, comparative species data. But the last paragraph was written plainly: we must reconsider our definitions of stability, of courage, of strength. In humans, stress is not merely a warning, it is a call to arms. They do not simply survive fear, they mobilize it. They burn it as fuel. Their adrenal glands are not just organs, they are triggers. And when pulled, they do not retreat, they ignite. In his private journal, Trelvec added only one line: "We are lucky they are on our side." A year later, during an asteroid impact drill on Station Pyrex, the artificial gravity destabilized, causing a cascade system failure in the environmental seals. Darren responded before the alarm finished sounding. He didn't think. He acted. Later, as they reviewed footage of him sprinting across a collapsing catwalk with a toolkit in one hand and a barely consciousness Krelax technician over his shoulder, someone asked him, "What made you run in?" Darren sat back, wiped his forehead, and said, "Same thing that always does. I got scared." Then he smiled faintly. "So, I moved." That night, in the station's quiet medbay, with ice on his shoulder and compression sleeves on both legs, he received a message from Trelvec. "You continue to defy expectation. I suggest you rest." Darren replied, "Eventually, but not yet." And when the lights dimmed and the station settled into its cycle of artificial night, Darren lay there quietly, heartbeat slow, muscles sore, lungs steady. He wasn't calm, he was ready. Because that's what fear did.